Our world is a giant machine with billions of moving parts. Its primary fuel is oil. Here in the United States, 98% of our 300 million cars and trucks run on gasoline. Nearly 100% of our farm vehicles are diesel-powered. 99% of our railways run on diesel as well. And all of our planes fly on jet fuel. As long as the oil flows, we'll be just fine. But what happens when it stops? Experts tell us that it's not a question of if, but when.
We always knew that the oil would run out sooner or later. It's a non-renewable resource. But it was always assumed that it would be several generations from now. It would be in our grandchildren's lifetime or sometime after that. And by that time, we'd figure out something else. But here it is, the beginning of the 21st century, and we're already starting to see the signs of global oil production peak. And where's our plan B?
Failing to plan is planning to fail. And I have not seen any plan so far.
A report issued in February 2007 by the U.S. Government Accountability Office states that world oil production is expected to peak sometime within the next few decades. But despite this prediction, the federal government hasn't devised a plan to deal with the frightening consequences. As the world's oil supplies become depleted, we could be faced with rationing, social unrest, and even war.
The demand for oil keeps increasing, particularly with China and India becoming nations of drivers. And with the demand increasing and the supply decreasing, there will be a crunch.
The worst-case scenario is a global recession, and the recession seems to be going on and on. The argument of do something about it is increasingly brought to governments, and they turn to military action.
We are on our way to a disaster. So in order for us to avoid that, we better get ready and be prepared.
But while everyone feels the pain at the pump, very little has been done to prepare for the worst.
The average citizen doesn't feel any real threat from this because they've always had what they needed. Technology has always come through, and their leaders have always come through in one way or another, and they just believe that the future is going to be like the past.
But this time, it may be different.
I fear in my heart that it is too late and we cannot overcome this problem.
The challenges are staggering. The transition from fossil fuels to alternative renewable energies is only now beginning to be ramped up. Solar and wind could help, but at present, they provide less than 1% of our energy. Besides, they produce electricity, not fuel for transportation. Oil is not only our main transportation fuel, it also provides nearly 50% of all our energy needs. Petrochemicals are also the basic compounds in the majority of our day-to-day products, like plastics, asphalt, tires, polyester, as well as cosmetics and pharmaceuticals. We didn't always rely on oil. Prior to the mid-19th century, the major sources of power were animal, human, wind, water, coal, and wood. When Colonel Edwin Drake drilled the first American oil well in Pennsylvania in 1859, few realized how important this product would become for our society.
When we first started using oil back in the 19th century, it was for lubrication and also for lighting.
But a few decades after Drake's first well, the automobile made petroleum a vital resource. To feed this hunger for oil, geologists were continually on the hunt for more oil fields. petroleum fueled the technological expansion of America and the world. It was in planes, trains, and automobiles. Cheap and plentiful, oil was both the goose and the golden egg, stimulating progress that seemed as if it would go on forever. But in the 1950s, a crack appeared. Shell Oil's chief geologist, M. King Hubbert, came to an ominous conclusion.
In 1956, he made a prediction that the U.S. dominance in oil would come to an end around 1970, when our ability to extract oil from U.S. wells would start to decline. It was not very well received at the time because people thought that the supply of oil would go on increasing exponentially forever.
That's because during the 1950s, the U.S. had thousands of productive oil wells, pumping 10 million barrels a day. But since we used only 7 million, we were able to export our surplus. At the time, the world was consuming 20 million barrels of oil a day, and the U.S. was providing half of the world's oil. But Hubbert's prediction proved correct. After 1970, U.S. production peaked and began to slip.
Since 1970, the U.S. has been producing, on average, less oil every year.
Today, the U.S. produces only 8.3 million barrels of oil each day, yet consumes more than 20 million barrels.
And so that's why we have to import something like 2/3 of the oil that we use now.
Every day, America buys around 12 million barrels of foreign oil.
We are taking a huge amount of our wealth and transferring it to oil-producing countries, some of which are not our best friends.
Not only are the U.S. and many European and Asian nations relying on foreign oil, much of that oil is getting harder to obtain.
We haven't run out of oil. What we've run out of is readily accessible, high-quality, low-cost oil. There will be oil around for another 100, 150 years. Ever more difficult to get, ever more costly.
There was a second part to Hubbert's prediction. He calculated that world oil production would peak during the early part of the 21st century and slide into permanent decline. Some experts today believe his peak oil theory has already been confirmed.
It's much like the story of the boy who cried wolf. And people learn not to pay attention, but at the end of the story, the wolf really does show up. And at the end of this story, the wolf really will show up in the fact that oil will run out.
Despite this, for decades we've been increasing our dependence on oil.
Part of us understands that oil can't be forever. And yet we're kind of addicted to this infrastructure, this culture that we're in.
People have left the cities and they've left rural areas. There's been huge economic growth in the suburbs and the exurbs. And driving a car is not discretionary. This is how you get to work, do your shopping, go to school. The car is really part of how people live. And they like to do that particularly in big SUVs, which are fast and comfortable and people think are safe.
And now, as China, India, and other developing nations are rapidly industrializing, they're creating an energy-hungry consumer class. As oil production inevitably begins to max out, there will be less to go around, with dire consequences.
I just can't imagine societies willingly accepting an enormously decreased quality of life when they have a huge military that could get the oil.
Many experts worry that with transportation, industry, agriculture, and communications grinding to a halt, the result could be a desperate scramble for the basic necessities of life. Region against region, nation against nation.